Have you ever achieved what you once dreamed of, only to feel empty? Or have you ever felt that no matter how much you have, it's never enough? A young man once found himself asking these very questions. On the surface, he seemed successful, but deep down, his life felt hollow. Joy seemed just out of reach. One afternoon, hoping to ease his mind, he took a walk in the park. He had a good job, a stable income, yet he felt lost, as if he were running in circles, chasing things that never truly satisfied him. As he wandered, lost in thought, he noticed a familiar figure sitting quietly on a bench, a man with a gentle presence and a serene look in his eyes. It was Mr. Anderson, his old teacher who had retired years ago. The sight of Mr. Anderson brought back memories of simpler days, times when everything seemed lighter. Mr. Anderson looked up and smiled as he recognized his former student approaching. "Look who's here! It's been a while. How have you been?" There was a kindness in Mr. Anderson's gaze, the knowing look of someone who had lived through many of life's ups and downs. "What's troubling you?" he asked gently. The young man couldn't hide the weariness in his eyes. He sat down beside his teacher, feeling a strange comfort in Mr. Anderson's presence. "Mr. Anderson, I have a good job, a life that many people would envy. But I still feel empty. It's like every day is a race, and the finish line just keeps getting farther away." Mr. Anderson listened carefully, his expression thoughtful yet calm, creating a space of understanding and quiet anticipation. And so, their conversation began, a seemingly chance encounter that would soon reveal itself to be a pivotal moment, as the young man would begin to question the very nature of happiness and fulfillment. Have you ever achieved what you once dreamed of, only to feel empty? Or have you ever felt that no matter how much you have, it's never enough? A young man once found himself asking these very questions. On the surface, he seemed successful, but deep down, his life felt hollow. Joy seemed just out of reach. One afternoon, hoping to ease his mind, he took a walk in the park. He had a good job, a stable income, yet he felt lost, as if he were running in circles, chasing things that never truly satisfied him. As he wandered, lost in thought, he noticed a familiar figure sitting quietly on a bench, a man with a gentle presence and a serene look in his eyes. It was Mr. Anderson, his old teacher who had retired years ago. The sight of Mr. Anderson brought back memories of simpler days, times when everything seemed lighter. Mr. Anderson looked up and smiled as he recognized his former student approaching. "Look who's here! It's been a while. How have you been?" There was a kindness in Mr. Anderson's gaze, the knowing look of someone who had lived through many of life's ups and downs. "What's troubling you?" he asked gently. The young man couldn't hide the weariness in his eyes. He sat down beside his teacher, feeling a strange comfort in Mr. Anderson's presence. "Mr. Anderson, I have a good job, a life that many people would envy. But I still feel empty. It's like every day is a race, and the finish line just keeps getting farther away." Mr. Anderson listened carefully, his expression thoughtful yet calm, creating a space of understanding and quiet anticipation. And so, their conversation began, a seemingly chance encounter that would soon reveal itself to be a pivotal moment, as the young man would begin to question the very nature of happiness and fulfillment. Mr. Anderson leaned back on the bench, folding his hands thoughtfully. He looked at his former student and began, "Have you ever heard of Epicurus?" The young man shook his head, curiosity sparking in his eyes. Epicurus was an ancient philosopher who believed that happiness doesn't come from luxury or wealth, Mr. Anderson explained. Instead, he taught that true joy can be found in the simplest of pleasures, a good meal, a quiet afternoon, or the laughter of friends. For Epicurus, happiness wasn't about collecting more things, but about appreciating what he already had. A loaf of bread, some cheese, and a peaceful moment with friends were enough to make him feel fulfilled. Mr. Anderson paused, allowing the weight of the words to settle. "You see, Epicurus understood something that many people today forget," he continued. He knew that possessions and wealth often complicate life rather than enrich it. Happiness, he believed, comes from appreciating what's simple and close to us, things we often overlook while we're busy chasing what we think we want. The young man nodded slowly, his mind drifting to memories of times when he had felt genuinely happy. Oddly enough, those moments were always simple. Laughing with friends, a quiet dinner with family, a walk at sunset. He had been happy then, though he hadn't thought much about it at the time. Mr. Anderson then shifted gears. "Let me tell you about another philosophy. The Stoics." "The Stoics," the young man repeated, his interest piqued. "Yes," Mr. Anderson nodded. "The Stoics believed that true happiness comes from within, from a place of inner peace. They taught that if we can limit our desires, we can avoid disappointment. You see, the more we want, the more likely we are to feel unfulfilled. But if we learn to appreciate what we have, to desire less, we can find a deep and lasting contentment. He continued. The Stoics saw the world with a kind of practical wisdom. They believed that life will always bring challenges and that we can't control everything, but we can control how we respond. By lowering our expectations, by accepting things as they are, we can find happiness in the ordinary, in the things that are often right in front of us. The young man felt a sense of clarity start to form. All his life, he had been chasing, striving, pushing for more, believing that fulfillment was somewhere out there in the future. But maybe it was here, in the present, waiting for him to notice. Mr. Anderson looked at him, his eyes soft but intense. You see, life doesn't have to be complicated to be meaningful, he said. In our modern world, we're often told that success requires constant achievement, constant accumulation. But sometimes, the most meaningful life is the simplest one. Sometimes, simplicity is exactly what we need to feel free and at peace. The young man listened, feeling as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had started to lift. Mr. Anderson smiled, sensing that his student was beginning to understand. He leaned forward slightly, as if about to share something personal and profound. Let's talk about a few things you can start doing right now, he said. Simple practices that can help you feel more grounded, more connected to the life you already have. The young man listened closely, eager to hear more. First, gratitude, Mr. Anderson said. Every day, take a few minutes to write down 3 things you're grateful for. They don't have to be big things. Maybe it's the warmth of the sun on your face, a good meal, or a kind word from a friend. When we make a habit of noticing what we have, we start to see the richness of our lives. The young man nodded, thinking about how rarely he'd taken time to appreciate the small comforts in his life. He realized he'd been so focused on what he didn't have that he'd missed the good things that were right in front of him. Mr. Anderson continued. This brings me to something called JOMO, the joy of missing out. In our world, people are obsessed with FOMO, the fear of missing out. They feel pressured to be everywhere, to see everything, to keep up with everyone. But sometimes, the best thing we can do is to step back, to disconnect. The young man looked intrigued. What does that mean exactly? It means, Mr. Anderson replied, that you don't have to be a part of everything. Take a day for yourself. Step away from social media, from constant notifications. When you're not busy comparing yourself to others, you can start to hear your own thoughts, your own needs. You'll find peace in just being present, rather than worrying about what you're missing. The young man considered this. He could see how JOMO, the freedom to miss out, might give him a sense of calm he hadn't felt in a long time. The endless stream of updates, events, and expectations had been weighing him down, and perhaps he needed permission to let go. Mr. Anderson leaned back again, giving his student a moment to absorb it all. And lastly, he said, make time to clear your mind. Our lives are full of noise, full of endless tasks and worries. Every day, take a few minutes to just be still. You can meditate, take a quiet walk, or simply sit and breathe. Let yourself unwind. Let your mind empty out. This practice will help you stay centered, grounded, even when life gets hectic. The young man felt a sense of relief, as if these simple suggestions offered him a path forward, a way to find peace without constantly striving for more. He had been so busy trying to keep up with the world that he hadn't noticed how much it was costing him. Mr. Anderson watched him quietly, as if he understood exactly what his student was feeling. The young man sat quietly, reflecting on Mr. Anderson's words. A gentle calmness began to settle over him, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of peace he hadn't known he'd been missing. He realized that perhaps happiness wasn't about constantly reaching for more, but about truly valuing what he already had. The simplicity of Mr. Anderson's suggestions felt liberating, as if the weight of striving was slowly lifting off his shoulders. He took a deep breath and decided to put Mr. Anderson's advice into practice, right there on the park bench. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small notebook and pen. He began to jot down 3 things he was grateful for in that very moment. First, his health, something he'd taken for granted but suddenly felt immensely grateful for. Next, his job, which, despite its pressures, allowed him stability and growth. Finally, his family, their unwavering support, always there, even when he'd been too distracted to notice. Looking down at the list, he felt a warmth spread through him. These were things he had right now, not someday, and they were enough. As the young man finished writing, a series of memories surfaced. He thought about the laughter of his friends over a simple meal, the cozy warmth of his childhood home during the holidays, the small but joyful celebrations he'd had with his family. These were memories he'd barely noticed in the rush of daily life, yet now they felt significant, grounding him in a new appreciation for what he already possessed. How had he missed the joy in these simple moments? Mr. Anderson watched him with a knowing smile, sensing the shift in his former student. After a moment, he spoke softly, as if offering one final piece of wisdom. Sometimes, the path to happiness is not about adding more to our lives, but learning to appreciate, and even reduce. The less we desire, the more we can see what we truly have. We don't need to fill our lives with things to feel fulfilled. Often, living simply, with gratitude and presence, is all it takes to find peace. The young man looked up, meeting his teacher's eyes with a newfound understanding. He felt lighter, as though Mr. Anderson's words had given him permission to step off the treadmill of endless ambition and simply be content. With a gentle smile, Mr. Anderson added, "When you stop chasing what you don't have, you make room for what you do have to truly fulfill you. Remember, there's no end to desires. They'll keep pulling you along, keeping you restless. But contentment, that's within your reach anytime you choose it." As they sat together in silence, watching the sunlight fade behind the trees, the young man realized he didn't need to chase happiness any longer. It was already here, in moments like these, quietly waiting to be noticed. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, gratitude, and a sense of presence he hadn't felt in years. When he finally stood to leave, he turned to Mr. Anderson, feeling a surge of gratitude he could barely express. He realized that while he had come here searching for answers, he was leaving with a sense of clarity he hadn't expected. As the young man stood to leave, he felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The conversation with Mr. Anderson had opened a door within him, revealing a new way of looking at life. He no longer felt the need to chase happiness as if it were some distant prize. Instead, he realized that peace was something he could cultivate right here, by appreciating what he already had. With each step away from the bench, he felt a growing sense of clarity, a quiet contentment that came not from achieving more, but from understanding what mattered. Mr. Anderson's words echoed softly in his mind, grounding him in a truth he had long overlooked. As he walked, the young man glanced around, noticing the gentle sway of the trees, the laughter of children in the distance, the warmth of the fading sunlight on his face. These were the moments he had been missing while looking ahead, and now he was fully present to experience them. It struck him how much beauty was around him, how much he had overlooked in his pursuit of a happiness that had always seemed just out of reach. He thought about his plans for the coming weeks, the constant meetings, the goals he'd set, the endless striving, and yet, for the first time, he realized he didn't have to chase after every opportunity or meet every expectation placed upon him. Instead, he could choose to slow down, to focus on what brought him genuine joy, and to savor the present moment without rushing forward. The young man took a deep breath, feeling a sense of release as he let go of the pressures he had carried for so long. He promised himself that he would carry these lessons with him, to be grateful, to embrace the joy of missing out, and to find peace in stillness. He thought of the small notebook he'd used earlier and decided to make it a habit. Each day, he would jot down 3 things he was grateful for, reminding himself of the abundance in his life. As he continued down the path, he glanced back at the bench where Mr. Anderson was still seated, watching him with a warm, knowing smile. The young man gave a small wave, feeling as if he were saying goodbye, not just to his teacher, but to the part of himself that had always been restless, always searching. A new chapter was beginning, one of contentment and peace. Sometimes, happiness isn't something to be chased, but rather something to be noticed. Too often, we're told that fulfillment lies in having more achievements, more possessions, more experiences. But what if we pause to consider the possibility that happiness might already be here, in the life we're living right now? Perhaps in the warmth of a loved one's smile, the quiet of a morning cup of coffee, or the comfort of a familiar routine. What if, just for today, we tried an experiment? At the end of the day, sit quietly and write down 3 things you're grateful for. Don't overthink it. Maybe it's the roof over your head, the meal on your table, or even a simple act of kindness. When we practice gratitude, we begin to see that there is already so much to appreciate in our lives. This simple act can shift our focus from what's missing to what's abundantly present. As you go about your days, consider trying JOMO, the joy of missing out. Disconnect from the endless stream of information, the need to keep up, the pressure to be everywhere. Instead, take a day to slow down, to listen to your own thoughts, to rediscover the things that make you feel truly at peace. You might just find that life feels fuller, calmer, and more meaningful when you step back from the rush. And finally, take a few moments each day to clear your mind. Life is filled with distractions, responsibilities, and pressures that can weigh us down. Allow yourself a few minutes of stillness, to breathe, to let go of the endless list of things to do. In that space, you may find that your mind feels lighter, your heart more open, and your spirit more at ease. Perhaps what you're searching for isn't far away at all. It's here, in these small, precious moments. Sometimes, all it takes is a shift in perspective to see that happiness has been beside you all along, quietly waiting for you to notice.